presented in each room. Each year, during Pride Month, we evoke the names of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. We must honor these legacies by taking a hard look at the sacrifices these women have made to survive, to help our communities, and to fund the STAR Project. Yet, at the same time, we so often only hear those names evoked during Pride Month. Have these legacies of queer community, and specifically of Black and people of color in the queer community, been subject to tokenism?
Are we starting with me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. So was the question asking for should Black trans people have space or create their own space? I'm sorry, I wasn't really getting the question.
Yeah, the main question is have these legacies, such as the legacies of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, been subject to tokenism because they only seem to be mentioned during Pride Month, only in the month of June.
Yeah, I get that. I do feel like there is some type of tokenism. It's just in the whole experience of gay pride and the festivities. A lot of people like to go there for the parade and don't really understand the actual history behind it. But I do feel like what we're doing today, educating people and stuff like that, that people are gonna understand it and learn more about Marsha P. Johnson, the real story and the real reason behind the Stonewall riots and the real reason behind our gay pride festivities and stuff like that. So it's a yes and a no for me, but I have hope that a lot of people are trying to, reach out and understand more about Black trans and the issues that they face.
Thank you, Michael. Good Reverend.
I would just add that in a sense of the question about tokenism, I learned a lot more about Marsha P. Johnson watching this video than has ever been mentioned in the telling of the history that I've ever experienced before. I think that having the whole story, being able to see the whole person more, also pushes back against that tokenism. We're not just talking about the one night at Stonewall. We're learning about Marsha P. Johnson's whole life and her whole personality and who she was as a person.
Elise.
You're muted, beloved.
Sorry about that. Yes, I believe that the tokenism of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera is a really, really serious issue. And it's hurtful because in the video, it is stated that Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera is a reason why LGBTQ people have your rights. It's a reason why you all can get married. So why is it that Black trans women are always the afterthought? Why is it that Black trans women, you all, during Pride Month, it's always, rainbows and, it's the Pride Parade and it's Stonewall and, it's Marsha P. Johnson this and Sylvia Rivera that, but I feel like that gets lost within the community because of the discrimination trans women face. And I feel as though to overcome that tokenism, there needs to be accountability, and there needs to be accountability, especially within these larger LGBTQ organizations, to actually not just say Black Lives Matter or mention Stonewall very passively, but to actually integrate that history into everything that they do, and to ensure that Black trans women are not just uplifted, but are thriving within the community. Then that's when that tokenism goes further and it's not just lip service.
Holiday.
Oh, it's my turn. Okay. So unfortunately, I hadn't known much about Marsha P. Johnson at all, or Sylvia Rivera either, because it's just something that is brought up once a year, and we don't really talk about them outside of Stonewall. So it was really nice to see that documentary and understand who the person was. As for tokenism, it's annoying to me because we hear about these women once a year, but that's it. Like, that's all we get to know is like, oh yeah, somebody threw the first brick and now we have gay rights. And there was so much more in between that we don't know because they kind of hear the names and then they kind of just skip over all the rest, all the other things we have to go through to get to this point. And I want to say, if that's true, like if they revere these women so much for what they did, then why are they the least protected people to exist? Why don't we care about them more? If they are the reason that we can be the way we are, why don't we care for them? They're trans women being killed every day viciously, and it doesn't get the attention it deserves. So the tokenism is irritating, and we have to do better at including the whole story and appreciating the people that got us to this point right now.
Yes. Danette.
Yes. Tokenism, I would say definitely, of course, there is tokenism. But when we stop to think about that, even when we think of the civil rights movement as a whole, some people may say that Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were tokenism because we hear about them every February. And those are the two people that reoccur, and we hardly hear anything else about civil rights movement. But a lot of times people also don't know what is behind or what was behind the movement in and of itself. And that Rosa Parks and her involvement was very calculated. Her involvement was something, and she was an activist long before she didn't stand up on the bus. And so when it comes down to tokenism, it's an unfortunate thing. And yes, I do believe that they have been tokenized, but one of the things that I have to say is that there has to be a reckoning, I think, within both the Black community and the LGBTQ community, because for people of color in general, it is very difficult to kind of transcend in both communities because we're ostracized in many ways on both sides. And so I think there needs to be a reckoning as we're talking about Black Lives Matter, that we include Black queer lives, Black trans lives, all those matter as well. And when we are looking at people who are not people of color, we also need to have them, white people, help out and be there, queer white people, be there at the Black Lives Matter march, speak for us, be allies. And so I think there's a reckoning that has to come within the LGBT community and the Black community. And I will also say, as an academic, definitely academics and making sure that they are a part of our history, not just kind of skated over, that's important too.
Yes, excellent. As we're moving forward, I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, the conversation portion is being recorded. Tara just wanted me to remind y'all of that. So I just want to reiterate that. If I didn't earlier, I may not have. But the follow-up question with our panel is, what are your experiences with tokenism? I can do this all day, but I'm really interested to know, what are some of y'all's experiences, our panelists, with being tokenized at the intersections of being Black, of being a person of color, of being queer, being on the LGBTQ spectrum? What is your experience with being tokenized? And again, I want to start with Michael, please.
Well, my experience with tokenism, it's been very up and down, I would say. I feel like me as a Black queer man, there's a lot of variables I can go into that with somebody who's not of color. Say with like in the workplace or something like that. I know with a lot of my white counterparts, they want me to speak for every type of Black issue or Black queer issue, just because I can have a coherent conversation or just know what I'm talking about and bring up supports and claims for it, and that's fine. But there's me personally, I don't talk for all Black queer people. I speak for just my experience of being a Black queer person. And that's very frustrating at times because a lot of people can't see past that. As a collective unit, they just see you as being, like I said, the end-all, be-all spokesperson for Black queer people. And I just really wish that would change, honestly.
I recall when I first joined my congregation as a member in Peoria, the Universalist Unitarian congregation there, that there were two committees within the congregation, one specifically on working on anti-racism and one on called Intersections, which is a committee specifically around LGBT issues within the congregation, supporting LGBT people in the congregation and outreach into the community. In both of those committees, I was within maybe a few weeks of joining the church, invited to chair and be a part of and leading those committees, because those are identities that I hold, and my actual interest was denominational affairs. So there are often times that within institutions that we get pigeonholed into the committees related to our identity or into uh, focus and different conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, when that might not necessarily be our top priority in that position.
Elise.
Absolutely. Well, my experience with tokenism, well, I have a very, very unique experience as a Black trans woman who grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods and being so used to being the only Black person in the room or the only Black, sometimes in LGBTQ nonprofit spaces, being the only Black trans woman in the room. I'm very used to being tokenized and people using my identity to prove that their organization is inclusive when there's a lot more work to be done within the organization. And it's something that I'm so used to experiencing that I'm just so used to it. And it's something that I feel as though happens to a lot of Black trans women that break through those barriers of employment discrimination and have the privilege of being in these rooms. And far too often, when a Black trans woman is being tokenized, she is seen as disposable. So she doesn't really stay at this, she isn't really involved for long. Her voice isn't really appreciated or acknowledged for long. And they move on to the next girl and they do that to her and then the next girl and the next girl. So it's a vicious cycle that Black trans women are in, right? And there's a lot of respectability politics as well as who is the Black trans girl that is digestible? Who is the Black trans girl that makes cis white queer people comfortable? Those are the trans women that get, picked for things. Those are the trans women that are included in meetings and conversations about Black trans people. So it's awful, and I feel as though now I'm seeing people get called out for that. So I'm hopeful for the future. So.
Ooh, thank you. Oh, I wasn't ready. Holiday, same question. What have been your experiences with tokenization?
So I came out later in life, like after high school, pretty much like as trans. So I was openly queer in high school, and I wasn't out in middle school. But I think most of my tokenization experiences happened in middle school, because I grew up in a mostly white area, and it was in a mostly white school. So I was used to being the only Black kid, or one of the only few Black kids in the classroom, on the playground, that kind of stuff. And so I would hear of like a lot of like, oh, I couldn't be racist. Like, this is my friend. We're friends. We are best friends. Stuff like that. Or the common, like, if we talk about slavery for like 3 seconds in history class, everyone, would turn and look at me, and I'd be like, well, I'm not a slave, but okay. Just little stuff like that builds up over time, and I, at least as far as I know, haven't been tokenized in my adult life as an openly trans person. I hope not. If you have done that to me, we're gonna have to fight. But I can't speak to my queer tokenism yet. Hopefully that never happens, but if it does, it's like, yes.
Danette.
Yes. As far as tokenism, I will. I got you beat holiday. I came out in my 30s, so I came out a lot later in life, and so the experiences that I've had have been pretty recent. So in grad school and also at work, and so a lot of times, and particularly being in where I am in academia, it seems like it's a box for people to check off. Oh, got my queer person. Oh, got my Black person. Oh, got my woman. So, fitting those, I fit 3 boxes, and that makes people happy. And there's also an emotional labor that goes with that, particularly being, again, in academia as a professor, being there for students who are, who identify as queer, being there for students who are Black, and then also being there for students who identify as being queer and Black, and being the only one on campus. And I like what Elise said about politics of respectability. So a lot of times it's a game that we have to play. I have to answer those questions, and I've taken it to the point where I answer those questions and I play a role, because at the same time I'm educating people. And I also know what I do in the classroom and the things that I teach. And so I see it as, okay, I'm educating people, and so I'll be your token, but there's a reason for it to a certain extent. And in order to get further, to give you information or give students information that they didn't have before. And so as far as being a token, yes, it does happen. And I don't think it's ever really going to not happen in a certain sense, because and a lot of it, I think, is what we do with that.
Thank you, Danette. Just want to point out, somebody said in the chat, there's not enough conversation about Bayard Rustin, and I'm gonna have to kind of agree, because rarely do we mention his name when those conversations take place, when we talk about this next topic, which is allyship. And so the next question that comes up is, making room is an empty gesture without action. This means funding specifically for organizations for trans women of color, federal data collection on violence, murder, and other crucial statistics involving this community, and the decriminalization of women's bodies. What are your thoughts on these issues and suggestions for ways to get this done?
Personally, we all know that our system or society is kind of wonky, to say the least. I don't think that as Black trans people, Black queer people in general, should be looking to our current government or our current system of things to try to, give us hope or give us the resources that we need. I feel like we should create our own type of resources. You know what I'm saying? More health centers, more community-based policing. You know what I'm saying? Just more stuff that's community-based towards people of color. I think that's where we can really make the start of it all. And I really like what you said about allyship. Allyship is key. It's very important. Black queer people can only do so much. Yes, we may be able to start the revolution, quote unquote, of the movement, but having white people, queer white people come in, even if you're not queer, just white people in general coming in and helping us, because at the end of the day, they're going to listen to white people more. They're going to listen to Black people in general, or just Black queer people, or Black trans people, just anything, Black, essentially, colored. But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh yes, having white people on the front lines, on the sidelines with us, helping make this movement go on further. That's what's really going to make the change, you know. And like I said, me personally, I'm not looking for a government or organizations or corporations to help me. I want to be that person and be able to make those decisions or make that the creation of programs or stuff that we need for our community. Because at the end of the day, who's better to know our community than people in our community, you know? But that's how I feel about that question.
Reverend.
I'm going to ask for clarification. I got lost in the framing of the question that I missed the question. You're muted. You're muted.
The term making room, sorry about that, is an empty gesture without action. So like funding programs for trans people and trans people of color, federal data collection, allocating those resources to investigating like murder and violence against trans bodies, as well as the policing of women's bodies and the decriminalization of women's bodies. So what are your thoughts on these issues, and what are your suggestions for how we get this done? Like allocating those resources.
So I struggle with the concept of allyship and the idea of making room to an extent that, especially around race, there's not really such a thing as an ally. There are either people who are anti-racist, or there are people that fall into different categories of racism, either segregationists or what's the other one? Segregationists or the assimilation. There are these different categories that people fall into. Segregationists wanting to get rid of, push out, destroy Black bodies, and the assimilationists that think that Black people can be improved and so for a white person to be an ally falls into that anti-racist realm, and that's an action and an ideology, and that's something that even within the Black community we have to be intentionally anti-racist in our work as well. So I struggle with that concept of allyship, both within racism and within around homophobia and transphobia.
Elise.
Yes, for me, I believe, especially with data surrounding trans people, there needs to be trans people doing this to ensure that the data collected is competent, trans competent, and actually correct. The last time data was collected about trans people was back in 2015, and that was the US Transgender Survey. And I believe that type of survey system, and they asked responding questions on like income, employment status, healthcare, education. There needs to be data on that is more current. So it definitely needs to be done. This data collection needs to be done by trans people, by grassroots organizations, not these $1 million corporations that have white CEOs who are cisgender, who don't really give a damn about Black trans people or the issues that they face. No, this needs to be grassroots led, and the bigger organization needs to be getting the money and then give those and working on grants and then handing that money off to the grassroots organizations to ensure that the integrity of this data is not compromised. So that is my stance on that.
So it sounds like this is also a good idea of allyship, is allocating those resources to a grassroots movement as opposed to them doing it themselves.
Absolutely, because within those grassroots organizations, it's more likely that there are trans people of color working there, and it's less political. There's less of those politics and the respectability politics of it all. Absolutely.
Yes. Holidays, same question, please.
Elise, you pretty much said what I was going to say. Actually, putting trans people in these positions, they know the community, they know what they've been through, they know what it's like, so they can speak to the problems and the money that we would need for A, B, and C. And white allies need to back them up. They need to make sure that they don't get kicked from the seat, they don't have a hard time getting the resources that they need, and amplify their voices. Don't talk over them, don't speak for them, let them speak, and then help them accomplish those things that they need to accomplish. It's the only way. We can't have cis allies speaking for us because they don't, you can't ever know what it's like unless you're us. So we need people, trans people in those positions of power, and we need people to listen and help follow through with those goals.
And Danette.
Referring to a seat at the table, when we're talking about that, we're talking about power, we're talking about privilege, essentially. And unless people are willing to give up that power and that privilege, then a lot of things are not going to change. So we need people that look like us and represent us in those positions, grassroots positions, but also I believe in the corporate positions, in the larger firms, in those positions who are making decisions, who are making change and deciding what goes on. Being a media person, I also think the media has an important role to play with how queer people of color in general are presented. I think that social media also has a major role to play in that, because presenting a different narrative other than what the mainstream media presents allows people to see a broader spectrum of what it means to be queer and what it means to be Black. But again, people talk about rules and regulations and this is what's here and so on and so forth. If again, people are not willing to give up that power, to give up that privilege, to break those rules or change those rules, then it's going to be difficult to push into those positions. But I will say too, as a community, as a Black community, you need to come together and organize. And again, that means, I think, in the Black community in general, that there has to be a reckoning with recognizing queer people and queer Black people. So.
Okay, so I just want to, as we're moving forward with our questions, I just want to say that the answers y'all just gave to that really did just knock out the next two questions. You've already addressed it, all of you, and quite beautifully, I might add, because the follow-up questions were, how do we, as queer Black people, define allies? You've all addressed that. And what are some actions white people, white LGBTQ people included, can do to be true allies to Black LGBTQ people and not just performative allies? I think Holiday, Elise, Reverend Marcus, everybody here already touched on these two issues. And Danette, your statement just now really emphasized the next question, which was transphobia and homophobia in the Black community are huge problems that we have to tackle to truly focus on dismantling all these racist systems. And what do you think we need to do to be totally unified in the Black community? So Danette, your answer to the second or third question already led into that question of what is it that the Black community should do or must do to unify and resist these systems of power. Because to me, when Black folks start saying homophobic things or transphobic things, they damn near sound like a Klansman. And it's like, so why do you want to sound like your oppressor, right? That's my struggle. And so I really, directing this at our panel, it's like, what do you think we need to do to be totally unified?
Yeah, like you said, I like how you made the analogy of how what the black community is doing to the LGBT community is the same thing that white supremacists are basically doing with black people, African Americans. It's not the same, but it's definitely close, and it's very if you look closely into it, it's very parallel to each other. And I do think that education plays a big role in the black community and LGBTQ community and how we can bridge that gap between us. I think once we know, we can let the black community know that homophobia is not, not good, transphobia is not good, and let them, show them the videos like we just watched today, the Marsha P. Johnson one, and having the conversations, the hard conversations. That's what it is. A lot of people don't want to have these conversations because they don't want to offend people, but people are dying. Black trans women are dying. Black queer people are dying. We can't not say anything anymore. And this is where we need to take it as our own personal responsibility, both the black community and LGBT community, to reach out to one another, let them know, hey, we're not all bad, or we're not, the things that you may have heard or the stereotypes that you may have heard, and hopefully that can, bring us together as a community, because we really do need it, both the black and LGBT community.
Reverend.
I've been reading the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibrahim. Can't think of his last name at the moment, but a lot of
Ibrahim Kendi.
Yes, thank you. A lot of what he examines in his book is these concepts of race being built around power. And when we look at homophobia and transphobia specifically, those are also built around power. It's specifically about gendered power and gender hierarchy, and as queer people, we challenge that system. I think that it is built into racism as well within the Black community, that we then take those components of power that are around gender and we hold on to them, so we have some semblance of power in a society that we, as Black people, we've had our power taken away by being labeled the Black. I think when we have these conversations about how power is built into the system, and how if we're going to be anti-racist as Black people, that includes being against homophobia and transphobia, because that's built into race. These concepts of gender are built into how how Black people are oppressed. So as a Black person, you cannot be an anti-racist if you are homophobic and transphobic.
I'm going to give that a well and an amen. So, Elise, please.
Yes, I agree that transphobia and homophobia are huge problems within the Black community. And what we need to do within the Black community to dismantle that, I believe, is a lot of things. We need to ensure that the Black community has access to mental health services, I believe, because what the Black community has been oppressed for over 400 years. So that's a lot of trauma, a lot of pain and sorrow. So I feel as though there needs to be mental health services that are readily available to the Black community. And to expand on that, and as well as what Marcus was saying, toxic masculinity, unpacking toxic masculinity in the Black community, and how religion plays a role in that, and how religion can be a source of oppression, and how it all just ties in together within that within that toxic masculinity, and how Black men are supposed to be so masculine, and any hint of femininity revokes your your male identity and you're just seen as an outcast. And, you know, this type of black toxic masculinity is what leads to Black trans women being killed by our Black male lovers, right? So it's a vicious cycle, and there needs to be unpacking of gender stereotypes and gender as a whole and how we understand it, and how gender is just so fluid and how there's so many genders, and how there just needs to be lots of unpacking done and lots of education and healing, definitely.
Ooh, yes. Yeah, Holiday. Next. Same question.
Do you mind if I jump in real quick before that? Just
Please.
just being mindful of our audience, being mostly white folks. I do want to acknowledge that with the centuries of trauma and generational trauma that's born by Black people, that does cause inequity in things, but I don't want white folks to think that Black people need fixed. So I just wanted to put that out there. That being anti-racist is about leveling the playing field, but it's not about you fixing Black folks. So I just wanted to make that one note about trans folks needing access to healthcare. Absolutely, 100% agree. But it's not to fix us; it's to process through our.
Yes, the process. I agree, definitely. To process it and, you know, for sure.
I loved all of that, Reverend. Thank you. That, yes, we don't need fix, we need health care. That's the T. Holiday, your perspective.
Okay. Unfortunately, cisnormativity and heteronormativity are systems of white supremacy. So when we put this on our community and like make people feel bad and worthless and feel like they can't be unified with the community because they're being ostracized, it makes for huge problems. And I'm not sure why the community as a whole is so homophobic or transphobic, and I'm not sure if it's because of buck breaking or religion sort of clouding our judgment, maybe because Christianity comes from white people and we come from Africa, and I'm sure we didn't have that sort of stuff surrounding us. So now that we have like these systems of whiteness sort of permeating in our beliefs, it really affects how we operate around each other. And I think what we need is acceptance, number one. You have to accept that people aren't all going to be the same. They're all going to have different preferences, genders, sexualities, and that's just what it is. And on top of acceptance, we need support. You have to support people. You don't always have to agree. That's fine. We can't make you do anything, but you have to support us. Because I notice when things like George Floyd happen, I always see Black queer people stepping up immediately. Not a second thought. There's no one that reacts faster than Black queer people everywhere. And like the Black Lives Matter movement was founded by 4 Black women, and some of them are queer. So it's like we're always stepping up for you. So why don't you have our backs when we have your backs, regardless of everything you've ever done, said, believed about us, whatever? It's always people like us at the forefront with no fear, because we want us to be okay. We don't care the consequences. We want to fight for our own. So we need acceptance, number one. Accept us. And number two, we need your support. We need your allyship. We need you to be unified with us so we can actually fight this. We have to be unified. We can't focus 75% of our energy on white supremacy, 25% of our energy trying to fix our own problems. So we won't be able to focus and accomplish the things we need to without complete unification.
Excellent. Thank you. Danette.
Well, I want to address something that Elise said regarding mental health, which I think is a definite thing that is needed in the Black community in general. And talk about that, it's also taking the stigma away of mental health in the Black community. The stigma of what it means to be a Black male. And so when we talk about that hypermasculinity, you know, what does that mean? And how do we kind of break from that ideology that Black men have to be strong, they have to be this, they have to be and hyper masculine. So I do definitely think there is a need in the Black community in general, but particularly the Black queer community for counseling. Again, not mental health when it comes down to fixing, but mental health as in to unpack and to talk about anything and everything that is going on. I also think that education is something that is very, very important. So I know that recently Illinois passed a law that they are going to be teaching about LGBTQ history, which is great and amazing, but at the same time, please don't leave queer Black people out of that discussion. Don't whitewash that as well. So someone mentioned earlier Bayard Rustin as far as being a person who was very instrumental in the civil rights movement, but he was not the only queer person that was in the or queer Black person in the civil rights movement. So there were a lot of different people, and I'm trying to bring up her name because I can't remember her name. Anna Pauline Polly Murray was a woman who I would say more dressed like a man. She participated in the civil rights movement, and actually Thurgood Marshall used her writing and called her writing like the Bible for law. But how many of us have heard of her? And I didn't really hear of her until I started doing research for the presentation that I did. So when it comes down to education, I do believe education is important to take away that stigma of what it means to be Black and queer.
Excellent, thank you. And I appreciate you bring up Polly Murray, because I didn't know who she was until my 30s. And I'm still in my 30s, but like it was just a few years ago by the first time I had heard her name. And much like Bayard Rustin and people who were equally as important to the movement. Moving forward, so earlier we touched on like the policing and the commodification of Black women's bodies. And so this next question really emphasizes that topic. So living within a reality where so many trans Black women and trans people of color, specifically women, are being murdered systematically at rates that our federal government is not even keeping track of it. We have to step back and look at how the LGBTQ community and the Black community views women and the commodification of their bodies. So when we call for the decriminalization of women's bodies from a legislative perspective, how does that look within our own communities in light of the way that we police women's bodies and the way Black women are policed in the media? And I believe we kind of touched on that a few questions ago. So really, what would it look like to stop policing the bodies of Black women, Black queer women, Black LGBTQ women, Black trans women? What would it look like to decriminalize that and stop policing women's bodies? Michael.
That's a good question. Education is going to be a big thing for me. I know I keep saying it, but it's definitely such a key thing. I believe about educating and listening to our Black women's voices, honestly. Like I believe you mentioned how Black women, especially Black trans women in general, are just at the front lines of every type of movements, riots, anything, honestly, and they don't get the same type of recognition or support that they should be getting, honestly. And I believe that we should change that, give Black women and trans women a seat at the table, and let not only listen to them, but hear them. You know what I'm saying? Like actively hear what they're saying, because their struggles are not much, different than ours, honestly. And that's what I really do believe. We should protect them, uplift them, and protect our Black women and trans women.
Yes, and I want to give credit to Holiday, because Holiday was the one who initially mentioned that it's the queer women and the trans Black women who step up and are like some of the first to march. So that's like your Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, and Patrisse Cullors, who were among the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. Reverend Marcus.
Again, I'm struggling with the following the questions. They're so long, but I think I'm just going to affirm the need to give Black women and femme Black folks ownership of their own bodies. I within the system that is. You can't address the system without addressing capitalism. I think that it comes down to being that simple. To commodify people's bodies, to put value capital over people is just, until we address that, there's no. George Floyd was killed for a fake $20 bill. No one knows if he knew it was $20 bill. That was fake $20 bill. There was just a fake $20 bill, and he was killed for it because that $20, that capital, had more value in that officer's eyes than his. And until we name that, there's no being anti-racist without addressing the capitalism component.
Thank you, Reverend. I think you touched on something rather profound right there, is the capitalistic notion and when we talk about the policing of Black people's bodies. Elise, your perspective, please.
My perspective is, I've noticed in LGBTQ spaces, there's a lot of policing, especially for Black trans women's bodies. I mentioned earlier, respectability politics of, if this Black trans woman is passable, then I'll take her seriously. If this Black woman is feminine, then I'll take her, I'll listen to her, or I'll help her or respect her. And I feel as though that's just ridiculous. I feel as though there needs to be less policing of who fits perfectly into gender stereotypes and who's the most, aesthetically pleasing to cisgender white people who are LGB. So there's just a lot of dismantling of gender stereotypes, and as well as what Marcus touched on. We live in such a capitalist society that we all have to survive in, right? So that means that we're surviving in a capitalist system that was never built for Black people or Black trans people. So Black trans women are out here just trying to survive in a world that doesn't see us as human sometimes, which leads to us being killed because we're just seen as objects, because we live at the intersections of race and gender. So there needs to be education and the dismantling of just awful gender stereotypes and the respectability politics, and just policy reform for sure. And I think someone else touched on, when a Black woman speaks up, listen. Don't silence her because you don't believe her. Just listen and change what needs to be changed. But listening is the key.
Yes. Yes, all the yes. Holiday, your perspective, please.
First, it's probably important to establish that trans women are people. I feel like people tend to view them as something other than, and trans people in general, but Black trans women especially, I feel like, especially if you're not passable, at least I like that point, they really have an issue with you existing. So first is acknowledging that they are people and they have feelings and their bodies are theirs and not your fetish, not your little secret. They're not any of that for you. It's for them. And education is important, understanding why they have their bodies and giving them the rights to use them how they please. And if there's a problem with how they use their bodies, then give them the opportunities. They do sex works and things like that because they cannot get a job and keep it, or they can't afford a house, so we have to do these things. So if you have an issue, help them get a job and keep it, help them find affordable housing, like help them with this stuff. We need support. You need to acknowledge their existence, respect it, be educated, and help them if you have a problem. And if you don't have a problem, just respect that they're people and they can do what they want with their bodies just like anybody else.
And I want to add that sex work needs to be decriminalized, period.
Period. Exactly.
It needs to be
Exactly right.
decriminalized. And Black women deserve to be loved just like everyone else. Black women deserve to be supported, and Black trans women deserve to be protected. Sorry, I just needed to throw that in there as well.
Period. You were totally right. You're people. So respect you as such. That's really it.
Yes, Danette.
Okay, a couple things that I'm thinking about. First thing is, I love what Lee said about when a Black woman speaks, listen. And I would like to say when a Black woman speaks, no matter who that Black woman is, listen. A lot of times, Caleb and Antonio know, one of our professors used to talk about being palatable. And so when Black women speak, a lot of times people will listen if they're palatable, if they sound educated, if they sound like they know what they're talking about. But we have to listen to Black women, whether it is the Black woman from the hood or if it's Angela Davis. All Black women, we need to listen to them when they speak, when we speak. Also, and I need to thank my girlfriend who was like, don't forget to talk about patriarchy. But yeah, we have to dismantle and address patriarchy when it comes down to addressing violence and the commodification of women in general, but Black women. And so when we have a patriarchal system that's in play, we have to address that. And when we talk about capitalism, it's all tied into that concept of patriarchy. So let's say you have we still have in weddings, the father still gives the daughter away. So unless we address those systems of patriarchy in politics, education, just in general, it is yes, Tara, burning patriarchy.
Yeah, patriarchy.
We do need to address that in order to address the issues that we've discussed. So.
Down with the patriarchy. Amen to all of it. And I'm sorry if I'm getting like really excited and my little window over here. It's just this conversation is giving me like 18 cycles of life, if you'll excuse me. Our next question, and this one's a kind of a somber one, but it's also very serious, pointing to some things that I believe that Michael and Holiday and, well, everybody has touched on already, such as like the murder rate of trans Black women, but specifically how mainstream media does not cover these cases. And so considering the volume of these murders that happened, I think in 2018, there's only 365 days in a year, but there were like over 350 trans Black women murdered within a 52-week period within a calendar year. And so how is it when the mainstream media is not covering this to the degree that they cover other issues, then how is it that we can make sure that their names are remembered? Michael, please.
Well, I believe Reverend Marcus alluded to the fact how we have gender and social type constructs already in place in our society. How I believe, like he was saying, it's. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Give me a second. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
How do we make sure that the name of the trans women, specifically the Black trans women who get murdered at a higher rate, how do we make sure that their names are remembered, especially when the mainstream media doesn't cover it?
Oh yes, that's what I was going to go with. That with Reverend Marcus was saying how we have basically like the patriarchy, or just different types of subcategories depending on how you identify, whether you might be a Black man, a cis straight man, or a Black trans woman. Just however you identify that, that's how you would rank on that little totem pole, I guess you would say. And Black trans women and just Black women in general are just usually are the lowest part of that totem pole, and that's, I believe personally, that's why women of color probably don't get as much attention. And like Breonna Taylor, and I believe it was Dominique, of the Black trans women who just died just recently. And I feel that, I know that there's like a saying say their names, but it's so crucial, honestly. Keep talking about them, you know what I'm saying? The reason people aren't talking about these issues or things aren't getting done is because people are scared, they're uncomfortable, but we have to make people uncomfortable in order for people to make change. Breonna Taylor's murderers still aren't arrested. One just got fired out of the 3 that they shot and killed her, and that's what infuriates me a little bit. Yes, I'm all for people getting their justice. Like, look in the case of George Floyd, he got all of the people charged. People just got the upcharge from the 3rd to the 2nd degree. Things are making changes, and we're making progress, which I love. I'm here for it. But what about a Black woman? What about a Black trans woman? We aren't getting the justifications and the ramifications that these people deserve. And I feel that the more that we keep pressing about it, and the more that we keep talking about it in the conversations, and just letting them know, like, hey, this isn't okay. When we talk about all Black Lives Matter, we mean all Black Lives Matter. We don't pick and choose which one that that we want to glorify, or to bring justice to. No, whether you're trans, cis, Black, white, you know what I'm saying? We all deserve to be treated like human beings at the end of the day.
Yes, Reverend Marcus.
I'm going to bring the church in. Watching that video about Marsha P. Johnson and her connection to faith was very powerful for me. I think that there are so many people of faith that are within our movement that the faith component of their work gets erased on the left. And the only aspects of faith and church that when we think of Christianity or Islam, that we think of are those political right concepts of that tradition. So there is a religious left. There is a religious left movement that is out there that often gets forgotten. And I think that a part of the process of remembering these trans women lies in ritual. And I know some folks don't like the Transgender Day of Remembrance, that it seems like it's what the corporations do once a year to make people feel good, but the ritual of that is important, and how you use that ritual. Just as I put a Black Lives Matter banner on my church, but I'm also living it. So building ritual into our lives around loss and grieving and lamentation are very important components of human spirituality. I think that are valid and valuable.
Yes.
Of course, yes. Elise.
Well, before going in too deep, I just wanted to acknowledge just say the names of some Black and brown trans people that have been murdered this past month and week. So I just want to say their names. Tony McDade, Raya Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Selena Reyes Hernandez. Those are the ones that I just wanted to highlight that literally just happened a week or so ago or within the past month. But we as a community need to hold the media and journalists in general accountable for dead naming trans people who have been murdered, for misgendering trans people who have been murdered, and just overall using transphobic and insensitive language. I've been seeing things like, oh, you know, the Black trans woman didn't disclose that she was trans. So it all, I see a lot of news reports that are underlyingly, not explicitly, but they're underlyingly saying that some Black trans women deserve to be murdered because we don't disclose our gender identity to cisgender men that we engage with. And that's complete BS, because most of the time we do disclose and they do know, and they still end up killing us because they can't deal with their attraction to us. Nonetheless, I feel as though Black trans people, we need to be creating our own platforms to ensure that our stories are affirming, and that they are competent, and that they tell the true side of our stories. And there's one Black trans woman who I know that has a blog, a news story blog. Her name is Monica Roberts, and her blog is called The Trans Griot. And I highly, highly, highly recommend that blog. She is an incredible activist, and she's always reporting on the murders of Black trans women. And of course, she ensures that affirming names are used, proper language is used. You know, so I would highly recommend that blog just to get a more affirming and more of a news reporting from Black trans voices directly. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend that blog. And we really need to, I feel as though white LGBT people need to use their white privilege and to call upon these news outlets and demand justice for us, because us trans people, we do a lot of labor already. So we need to distribute that labor to cisgender white LGBT people, because they have the privilege and they need to use it. So that is my stance on that.
Is it my turn?
Holiday, it is your turn, man.
Okay, I'll just make sure I can go. I want to make sure. Okay. So unfortunately, the news is bad at reporting any murders or violence against Black trans women. And it's gotten to the point where if I hear about someone being murdered, it's kind of like, oh, another one. Like, it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like, oh, it's normal to see this happening every day. And so we have to first hold people accountable and make noise about this every chance we get. Don't let people forget. Don't let it become so normalized that you don't really feel any emotion towards it happening. And like Elise said, you need to have white allies making sure that they hear our voices, not just hear it and listen and actually understand and do something about it instead of hearing it and brushing it off because it's us talking and not somebody white. So we need to make sure that we are constantly mentioning their names, making them known, making sure people are investigating, taking it seriously, not dead naming them in their reports, making sure that they can be honored in their legacy.
I know I'm next, and I know Caleb's screen froze. So I will first let me thank Elise for saying their names, and I think that is highly important to continue to say their names. During the primary, I had a chance to, at Coe College, where I teach, since it's in Iowa, we had a LGBTQ forum where the candidates, Democratic candidates, were, and that question was posed to the candidates, and the only person who at least had a list of names was Elizabeth Warren. And the impact that she made when she said those names was very powerful. Just to say the names and ask for a moment of silence, and understanding even what that meant. And so on one hand, yes, I think we do need to definitely say their names. I think we need to use social media as much as possible as a platform. One of the things that we all have, okay, most of us have cameras. Talk out, speak out about what's going on, and again, hold the media accountable for what they say and what they don't say. But I also think that in order for some of that to change, I think again we have to have that reconciliation when it comes down in the Black community, and also in the white LGBTQ community, as far as not pushing queer Black people to the margins, further to the margins.
Sorry about that. Were we able to get to Holiday?
Yeah.
And Ginevra, you, okay. I am so sorry. But before we go on to the last couple of questions, because y'all actually answered a couple of things that was already on the list of questions to ask. And also, Elise, thank you for naming those individuals who had been killed, because the only one of those names that I had heard in mainstream media, and it actually wasn't even mainstream media, was Tony McDade. The only one that I had heard. And so thank you for telling us about the other individuals who had been senselessly taken from our community. And so we have sort of already touched on this. I believe Reverend Marcus, you had already spoken on this, sort of the all Black Lives Matter. And it's become a mantra of our current civil rights movement. And so how has the whitewashing of queer liberation and queer erasure in the civil rights movement been sort of a critical hit to the movement? Like, it's been horribly whitewashed. And so rather than folks saying Black Lives Matter, we have started saying all Black Lives Matter. How has this sort of revitalized this movement itself? Michael, let's start with you.
Okay, so I kind of got the gist of your question. Can you paraphrase it for me again? I'm sorry.
No problem. How has all Black Lives Matter, not all lives matter, no, we're not here for that. All Black Lives Matter sort of reinvigorated the movement for queer liberation?
Well, I feel that it kind of reinvigorated it as to let people know that we're all just human beings, you know. We may have different preferences or we may present ourselves a different way, but at the end of the day, we still have hearts, blood still flows through our veins. We still have that communication type feel to it, you know. And I think that's really what we needed, either what we need or what we needed now, you know, honestly. As you can see across the country, we have thousands of people just coming together for Black Lives Matter marches, and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and just people just speaking about an injustice and just in general. And I feel that in itself is just, it's humbling, and it's very loving in a way, you know what I'm saying? Like, because I know we had a question about how there's a big, disparity between Black communities and LGBT communities and just people in general, and just seeing them all come together, it just makes us know that we're on the right side of history, essentially, and that just makes me happy.
Reverend.
I bring us back to the video that we just watched a little while ago, where Marsha P. Johnson in an interview said that we're not all free until all of us are free. We're not free until all of us are free. That's something that we're getting back to in this moment, that understanding that queer liberation we never achieved it. We kind of split into these movements of it's just like the conversation around anti-racism. You have the segregationists that will destroy the queer community, and then you have the I always forget this word, the simulationists that are like that. I can be specifically like I might love my husband, but I'm just as white American as you are. So there's this assimilation part of our movement that thought we were done, and we're at this moment seeing that no, we have to be just as intentional about anti-racism as and just as intentional about anti-patriarchy, around homophobia, misogyny, and xenophobia. Because if we don't, we're not free until none of us are free until we're all free. I think about the fact that we've had, I think now 6 Black men in this country found hung. 6 Black men have been found, and they've all been determined to be suicide. And we watched that film, and it said they found Marsha P. Johnson in the harbor, and it was ruled a suicide.
I don't think it was.
We have not come there as far as we think we've come. We're still repeating things. So I just want to. This moment has brought that back to our social consciousness.
Yes, and Elise, please.
Yes. From my perspective, this movement definitely, I believe, is revitalizing the queer and trans liberation movement. And I feel as though it's causing firstly, I feel like it's causing white LGBT people to really understand that the first Pride was a riot.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they finally are getting that. And I'm starting to see white people finally en masse start to stand up for Black lives. And that's, oh my gosh, that makes me feel finally seen and heard. And it's overwhelming in a good way to see so many white people marching at these rallies and just attending. And I've had so many cisgender white male friends of mine check in on me, which before this happened did not happen, very rarely happened. So that's been an eye-opener for me. So, and I'm seeing lots of call outs happening of harm that has happened before this movement. So I'm seeing people learning from their past mistakes as well, which is, it's just relieving to see. And I'm also seeing organizations and corporations, you know, say Black Lives Matter, and that's good to see. However, Black Lives Matter or All Black Lives Matter is not a marketing scheme. If you're gonna say that, mean it. And when I say mean it, take action and don't just have, you know, some flat policy changes to your organization. We want to see you actually step up and uplift our voices and take a back seat. And we want to see you put your body on the front lines and protect our bodies, because your bodies are more valuable to society than ours are. So that's what I really want to see continue to happen during the movement. And I want to continue to see white people and white LGBTQ people to be radical. I want to see that radical type of action happen. And, you know, I do like the word ally. I see a lot of allyship, but it can't be performative. And I want to go even further and say that allyship is good and all, but we also need accomplices. And that's what I have to say for now. That's all I have to say for right now. So, yes. And also, sorry, one more thing. I'm also seeing, I was seeing a news story in Brooklyn, I believe in Brooklyn, about a Black Lives Matter rally or protest that had like over, I forgot how many people, it was like, I don't know if it was like 3,000 people there or more, but it was like definitely over 1,000. And that was really emotional for me because cisgender LGBT people are finally waking up and seeing that Black trans people have been hurting for over a century, and they're finally are waking up and seeing that. So I just feel like there's an awakening happening, and it's just, it's overwhelming, and it's just, finally is all I can say, is finally that finally white people are getting it and are starting to do something about it. And that's all I'm gonna say. Sorry.
Don't be sorry. Don't be sorry. There were no lies there.
Yes.
Holiday, please, your perspective.
Could you repeat the question one more time? I just want to make sure I get it right.
Oh yeah. How do you feel saying all Black Lives Matter has impacted the current movement?
Okay, thank you. So I touched on this earlier, but we have to be unified. We have to work together to fight this. There's no way we can be scatterbrained and have so many issues and we're fighting this person and these people for this reason. We have to be unified, and it's nice to be recognized. It's nice to be acknowledged. It's nice to see people care. And I think seeing that we weren't making this up, like we weren't just, protesting and using our voices for no reason. We wouldn't do that. There's a reason, there's cause and effect for everything. And it is refreshing. And I feel like what's happening now is the push we needed to really organize and come together to revolt and say, look, we're done with it. We've been suffering for 400 plus years and we don't want to do that anymore. We want to be recognized as people with feelings and be taken care of in the country that has made sure to not take care of us, has written laws and policies to put us under and keep us under the thumb of white supremacy. And so having all Black Lives Matter is really important to the movement. It acknowledges everyone, and it makes sure that we know. I will fight for you and you fight for me. We have to be there for each other if nobody else will.
Thank you, Holiday. Danette.
Yes. When I hear that, I think of Audre Lorde's "I Am Your Sister," because we're all brothers and sisters. And on one hand, I say that we have to say all Black Lives Matter. In some ways, it's unfortunate because that means we have to, because that means there's an exclusion. And so, but I think it's necessary. And again, I mentioned it before about that reckoning within the Black community and just in community in general, is that all Black lives do matter. And when we say Black lives matter, again, that means all. And so there has to be some type of acknowledgement, accountability, and reckoning when it comes down to that.
Yes, thank you, Danette. Okay, so we've got one more question that was devised by our panel. And it's pretty exclusive to being in this region and being in the state of Illinois. And so what is it like to live in a state that is leading the charge in LGBTQ equality, but it still has some of the largest socioeconomic disadvantages for Black communities, Indigenous communities, and people of color?
Yeah. So I believe it was Reverend Marcus again who said that it all comes down to capitalism. I feel like I know we hate to talk about it, we hate to acknowledge it, but it's true. There's just categories to it. I feel like, you know, the same opportunities that, you know, our white counterparts get, our Black counterparts don't get, and it's even worse for people in the LGBT community, you know, and that's just my experience for it. And I'm very happy that, you know, we are very at the forefront of it. You know, we have very progressive policies when it comes to discrimination in the workplace and just LGBTQ issues in general. I'm very happy about, but I do feel like what we've all been saying is that we're not free or liberated until all of our people are free and we are liberated, you know? And I just feel like we should make a change about that. And I feel that like that comes with time and more education. That's just how I feel about that, yeah.
Thank you, Reverend Marcus. And by the way, Reverend, I want to attend your church, just hearing you. Before you give your perspective, you really make me want to go to church. I'm not even kidding.
I'm pretty sure there's a Unitarian Universalist church in Carbondale.
There sure is. There is. I've been to it once. Actually, a couple of times for a panel, in fact, that I was moderating. But yeah, you make me want to attend.
Absolutely. I'm still doing a lot of work to make sure that our churches are anti-racist. Not all of them are. So I wish you luck. I'm pretty sure the Carbondale Church is pretty good, but I can't guarantee it's going to be great. But to the question about living in a state that is leading the way on LGBT issues, but has not come full circle on addressing the inequalities of impacting our communities of color. It's kind of frustrating. A lot of the activist work that I have done has been based out of Peoria, Illinois, which has been ranged anywhere from number 1 to number 6 as the worst city in the country for African Americans. And we also happen to have the most elected LGBT elected officials per capita in the state. So there's this disconnect between again, liberation for all versus liberation for our white LGBT counterparts. The hard thing about the LGBT community is it's so broad. We are literally we are a subset of every community that there is in the country. and to maintain progress as LGBT people, we have to remember that that's the fact, that there are LGBT people within every community, and unless we address the challenges and issues of different communities within our society, we are leaving members of our LGBT community behind. Um, and that's just the way it is. It's frustrating. I think I watched Equality Illinois' Pride one day, one Illinois yesterday, the virtual Pride, and I have to say that they've made a whole lot of progress over the last several years to really center their we're not all equal. We're not equal until we're all equal. Their motto. Um, I, I'm glad that they've been more intentional about reaching across to the African American Black Caucus and the State House to what bills they're working on that they can advocate for as well. So I think that we've reached that point, that we finally are starting to understand that we need to be anti-racist as LGBT organizations, and I'm I'm excited about that progress.
Thank you, Reverend. Elise.
Yes, definitely. My perspective is that it's very similar to Marcus's. I'm very just, it's hurtful that this white LGBT people have left Black LGBTQ people behind. And I feel as though there were so many movements that happened. For example, after marriage equality, you know, I feel like a lot of cisgender white people got comfortable in their privilege, and just there was some things for trans people, such as there was lots of bathroom bills that were passed, and a very, 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 very important birth certificate bill that was passed in Illinois, which allowed trans people to correct their birth certificates. And it's generally not too difficult to correct your identity documents in Illinois. And I'm very, very, very thankful to live in a state that does that. But I feel as though there should have been, after marriage equality, there should have been even more than that. There should have been a focus on economic justice for Black LGBTQ people, but it did not happen. There should have been a focus on police violence, police brutality against Black LGBTQ people, especially Black trans women, but it didn't happen. So that was very frustrating to see that happen. And I'm going to say it again. Capitalism was not designed for Black people, especially Black trans people and LGBTQ people in general. So that's something that I have to live with every day, and we all have to live with every day. So there's a lot. I'm thankful that organizations are getting better and their eyes are opening, and they are trying to make this, to do the right thing and to be a part of this revolution. And that's all I have to say right now.
Thank you, Elise. And the good Reverend said it earlier in the chat, you know, speaking of how capitalism was never designed for us, we were the capital. We Black folks at one point were the capital. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Holiday, please.
So I don't think I really realized how progressive Illinois was because I've always lived here, and I haven't lived in a place where it wasn't like this. So I definitely have reaped the benefits of a progressive state. So like able to start hormones without any opposition, able to get surgery and be respected as myself. But of course, I have friends that live here, and I see how they're treated. And I think Illinois gets confused with Chicago. Like, Chicago is big city. This is what people always think about when you say Illinois. And so they're so progressive, blah, 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 but they're not, because Chicago is Chicago the city, and then Chicago the hood. So I know there are huge disparities between those two. And I'm from Chicago, so I definitely see it with my own eyes when I go up there. I see, like, this is how we live versus how they live in the city, and we're treated like this versus how they're treated there. And I think if you're in Carbondale, you're lucky, because this is probably the bluest area in the South. Anywhere surrounding Carbondale is bad news. So I feel like we have a lot of work to do. We have to listen to the people that are affected. If you have to go to the areas that are affected, like the hood, talk to people, say, okay, what do you need? How can we help you? How can we bridge this gap? Because if we just ignore them or let them continue to live in these poverty, the ruins, it won't get any better if we don't actively try to pursue and correct and help people that need it the most.
Excellent, excellent. Danette, please.
So I don't live in Carbondale anymore, but when living in Carbondale, I would say that it was interesting, I guess would be the word that I would say, being a queer Black person here, and also very lonely in many ways, and in many ways off-putting to a certain extent. I remember when being here challenging so many people, particularly during the Women's March and during marriage equality. You know, if I'm here and I'm marching, but where are you when it comes down to Black Lives Matter? And again, that just goes back to looking at all Black lives and that kind of the reconciliation that goes with Black in the Black community, the LGBTQ community. As far as economic impact, I think that, I think that many things, we talked briefly about the not having generational wealth and not having, we haven't had the ability to earn that. So with that puts us at a major disadvantage when it comes down to having economic wealth or in this society. A lot of times I compare it to, or I talk to, like, my students when they talk about the legalization, and I know that's most recent here in Illinois, the legalization of marijuana and the decriminalization of it, which is great, but at the same time, who's opening a dispensary? It's white people who've had the opportunity to accumulate that wealth and to have that money to make more money. So, you know, so we're left out yet again. And so some of that needs to be addressed. Okay, a lot of that needs to be addressed when we talk about economics and wealth within the LGBTQ Black community. But also, I do want to talk about, and my partner reminded me of him, Reverend William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, who does a lot exclusively talking about dismantling capitalism. Just throwing his name out because I know it's late, and thinking about that. And he's also very inclusive when he talks about the Poor People's Campaign. It's not just poor white people or poor Black people, it's everybody.
I want to jump in there on one note about generational wealth. And it reminded me of within that book, How to Be a Anti-Racist, this notion of colored blindness. For white folks that say that they're colorblind, that means that they cannot see racism or the legacy of it. So to say that you're colorblind means to say that you do not see that Black people have not been able to develop the generational wealth that white people have over the past 400 years. So I think I just wanted to point to that one thing as well.
Thank you, Reverend, for that. And thank you, Danette, because there's an entire field of academic research that talks about colorblindness as insufficient in critical race theory. For any of you legal scholars out there, that's where it comes from, the Harvard Law School, and the uprising of the lack of diversity that they had in the late 80s. So we're really over time. We were supposed to end about a half an hour ago, but due to technical difficulties, everything got held up. So I just want to carve out about 5 minutes or so for any of our remaining audience members to pose a question to our panelists. So if anybody has a question, they can send it to me. Oh, here we go. Okay, I'm gonna read it aloud. Has the diagnosis of gender identity in the DSM-4 changing to gender dysphoria DSM-5 made a positive or negative impact on the trans community? Was this enough to change in labeling definition, or should this diagnosis only limit mental health access, especially since the Black community in general has been historically underserved in the healthcare and mental health care? Does anyone think that this has contributes to the division in the LGBTQ community? And that's open to any of our panelists.
I want to speak to the imperfection of progress. I think when we look at like the Supreme Court decision that came out recently, making it illegal to discriminate based off of sexuality or gender identity, that didn't solve the problem. We still live in a at-will state where an employer can fire you for any reason. So it might be because you're trans, but they're going to come up with something else so they don't have to, they're not labeling it that. I don't think that there is a perfect answer in this specific conversation about the categorization of gender dysphoria in the DSM. For some people, gender dysphoria is something that they identify as having and are seeking the medical support in that system. They want somebody to talk to about it, to get through and to be more themselves. And that is something that is totally understandable. Gender dysphoria as a category of cognitive impairment is useful in court. I don't think that we want to be in a place that we're naming trans people as having gender dysphoria, but I think that some trans people will say that they have gender dysphoria, and that's completely acceptable. So there's not a perfect, and I think that it's okay to not be perfect.
Anyone else on our panel?
And I'll add that, at least in Chicago, it is more, transition medically is more accessible. I will say that through healthcare, LGBTQ healthcare organizations, such as Howard Brown, and just other healthcare organizations that have trans-affirming policies. And I know that a couple years back, there were a lot of hoops to jump through, per se, to medically transition, and you had to have certain letters from therapists to start hormones, and there was a lot of gatekeeping that was happening. So the gate, for the most part, at least in Chicago, the gatekeeping isn't as bad. You still need money for hormones, right? So there's still the economic aspect of it, but in terms of actually being approved for hormones, it's more of an easier process now, at least in Chicago. And I think that's a really good thing. And I'm not too sure about if that had to do with the gender dysphoria diagnosis identity and changing it, and that's why that happened. But I'm happy it did, and yeah, but healthcare is a really, 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 really important thing for Black trans people especially. And again, capitalism is what prevents certain Black trans people from actually getting access to healthcare. So it's a big revolution that needs to happen. There's a reckoning that needs to happen, and that's all I have to say.
I also want to note that it's not that the what is it called? The DSM is an international document. So because of what we have in Illinois, and it's easily transitioning documents a little bit easier in Chicago. It's not as easy outside of Chicago and Illinois, and it's even outside of the state of Illinois. So for states that have that have a requirement for some medical diagnosis, getting rid of that out of the DSM is immediately removing access to folks in those states to transition. So until it's kind of like, so it's the cart before the horse thing. So do we remove it from the book and remove access for folks that it's required to have a medical diagnosis? Or do we leave it in the book, move those states to get rid of medical diagnosis requirements, and then remove it from the book? So that's again, that note, that specifics about the enemy of the good being the perfect or something like that.
Excellent. Would anybody else like to chime in?
I have something real quick.
Please.
So I came out in 2017, but I didn't really know much about, okay, how do I transition? And as I started doing research, I noticed that there was a lot of hoops to jump through. You got to see this therapist for so long. They have to diagnose you with this, and then you have to, I don't know, sort of prove that you really feel this way. And I didn't like that. So I went to Michigan for surgery because I was like, I know who I am. I know what I have. I don't need you to tell me that. So I'm going to go ahead and do this myself. And I've noticed like gender dysphoria is a good tool, but it's also used to sort of gatekeep in the worst ways sometimes. Like there's a big debate that I've seen where it's like, you have to have dysphoria to be trans, and like sort of invalidating the experience of other people just because you feel this way and they don't. And honestly, if you never felt dysphoria, you're lucky, because it's really painful sometimes, and it's distracting, debilitating, all these things. And so for me, gender dysphoria is interesting. I avoided having to go through those hoops because I didn't want to feel like I had to prove myself and like prove that I was telling the truth to be validated and saying, okay, yeah, we'll give you these hormones. Oh yeah, we'll pay for your surgery. So gender dysphoria can be a roadblock sometimes in more than one way.
Well, as we come to the end of our time, I personally just want to thank every single person on our panel, every one of y'all, the work that you do, and really showing some vulnerability by answering these questions and sharing space with us digitally means everything to me. And y'all have touched on so many important topics, especially in discussing systems of oppression and the capitalistic notion of it. Because it seems like when shows like Pose or Legendary on HBO Max get started, then they start to see us, but that's because it's a show that's bringing in capital, for the white corporate masters. And it's like, that's the only time that they get to see us is when we're marketable via media. And that's where that capitalism comes in, going back to the good Reverend Marcus's assessment that we were once capital. In some ways, it appears that we still are. Just to throw that out there. And so, in closing, I really want to thank Tara Bell for getting this started and finding the panelists and getting us all together. This was a wonderful undertaking for me. I'm delighted to have met each and every single one of you, and I think it's wonderful to see my dear friend Danette, whom I haven't seen face-to-face in forever, all the way up in Iowa. And it has been an esteemed privilege to meet you all. I really hope that you all change the world, and I thoroughly believe that you all will. And and thank you, Tara. You're very kind. I see your chat. Thank you. And this was my pleasure. I enjoy being parts of these town hall meetings and these panels and these discussions as a moderator or as a participant. And you all touched on the same singular theme, is that some of the things that needs to happen is that we need to listen to each other. We need to see the humanity in each other, and we need to destroy the capitalist patriarchal system that has kept every single one of us as either the capital or as the oppressed, or both at the same time. Because that being the capital is what keeps us off into the wayside and gets our voices silenced. And saying their names is how we make sure that people are remembered. So I just got to, will do, Reverend. Thank you. I appreciate that. And so thank you all for participating. Remember, this is on behalf of the Rainbow Cafe. This is being recorded. Any other questions y'all may have for me or for our panelists, let us know. Thank you to all of the people who have been watching and stuck around. I appreciate y'all's presence more than you all know. And I hope to keep in touch with every single one of you because this panel means everything to me, truly. It truly does. So again, happy Father's Day to those who are fathers, and to the parents who are having to pull double duty. Happy Father's Day. Have a wonderful Sunday. Have an excellent remainder of your Pride Month. And remember that all Black lives matter, always. Take care, y'all.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.